Thank you. Well, today I'm going to talk to you about fertility, pregnancy in the early years from the perspective of the thyroid and the impact that seaweed and iodine has on thyroid. So I'm actually not an expert in fertility, pregnancy in the early years, other than that I've had 3 of them. So outside of the impact of iodine and thyroid, it's a huge field. I mean, infertility, as you all know, is a huge field. But I just want to take you through the aspect of it from my point of view. Now, first of all, I'm just going to briefly take you through the thyroid and iodine, because I'm aware that there may be people today who are here today who aren't practitioners from the general public and things. So those of you who are, very eminently well qualified and all the rest of it, you'll have to have a little recap on the thyroid gland to start with. Okay. So normally when you start to talk about the thyroid with people are a bit like, ooh, what's that? Where is it? What's it do? If you started talking about calcium deficiency in the general population, everybody would immediately go, oh, bones, that's okay. Once you start talking about iodine and seaweed, it's a bit strange. And basically what people forget is that, the thyroid controls almost everything else. It's like one of those houses that they have nowadays, these new sort of eco houses, where you go out and you can control the entire house from your iPhone. Your thyroid almost is that iPhone, because it's controlling the speed at which everything happens. It's also has this feedback loop that goes on. So every cell in your body has a receptor for thyroid hormone, and it constantly feeds back. So it goes back up to the pituitary gland and the hypothalamus, and then the pituitary gland, which also make other hormones. We tend to forget and think that hormones are something that only happen from the waist down, but this is what's happening here as well. Okay. So here's the classic loop that's going out, and if once it gets up into the hypothalamus and the pituitary and not enough hormones going back, of course that's when they release thyroid stimulating hormone, which then tells your thyroid to make more if it can, and if you're giving it the raw materials to do so. Okay, so we're going through that. I have to excuse me the bits that are falling off the bottom, because the hotel, I have to read those bits to you. The hotel system is a little different from most others I've come across. Okay, so thyroid cells have to have iodine. There is no other mineral that will substitute or do. The thyroid can only make thyroid hormones out of iodine, and it also uses the amino acid tyrosine to do that. So it's really important. You can't substitute it with any other mineral or vitamin, and that's what you need. So having that in your diet is really important. But unfortunately, it's a global problem that there's not enough around. 2 billion people globally. Statistics can be a bit difficult, because you can think, those could be lots of other people in other, countries where they're just not getting the sort of good diet. Does it really matter in this country as well? And it certainly does. There's lots of problems connected to it. Hyperthyroidism, when you're actually diagnosed, which is a long way down the chain of having a poor performing thyroid. When you're measuring TSH, it's only once the levels are elevated to a certain degree that the doctors will actually, do something about it or declare you hypothyroid. But it can be, years and years of a journey getting there, at which everything is starting to perform poorly. One of the most important from today is the fact that your thyroid is very much linked to hormone production. And so if it's not performing properly, you will always get hormonal disruption, not just in fertility and pregnancy, but there are links between things like PCOS and endometriosis and populations where poor thyroid performance is an issue. Okay. So it controls the metabolic rate, rising temperature, running your heartbeat, particularly controlling the speed at which the brain develops in children. This is happening, at the very, very beginning of pregnancy, so it's really important for the developing brain, and then also the growth. It controls the speed at which bones grow in utero as well. And it also activates the nervous system, so it controls things like attention levels and the speed of your reflexes. So if it's running a bit low, you start to get a whole host of problems. And a lot of these can be experienced together. A lot of these, sometimes people will have this sort of weight issues. That's a very common one. Being overweight, finding it difficult to lower it. Very common also is the tiredness and fatigue, particularly energy levels that sort of go like a dolphin. You're up 1 minute and down the next, and up 1 minute, and your energy just seems to fall off a cliff. And we tend to think of problems with thyroid as something that starts to happen with middle age. But once you look at it, I'll come back later, with teenagers. When they looked at teenage girls in this country, they found about 75-76% of girls aged 14 don't have enough iodine in their diet to have a properly functioning thyroid. And you look at things like, the difficulty concentrating. A lot of the things that teenagers experience, their inability to get up in the morning and perform, difficulties concentrating, some mild tendencies to depression even, all, are things which crop up with thyroid problems as well. Okay. And just for those of you who are not familiar with the thyroid at all, you can also have a thyroid that goes overactive. It's really another topic as well, because when people have got an overactive thyroid, one of the things is they're told to avoid iodine completely. And of course, even if you've got an overactive thyroid, your body still actually needs to make these thyroid hormones. But not all iodines are the same, which we'll come back to when we look at seaweed as well. Okay. So how do you know? Just briefly, there are these tests with the doctor, and it can be many years of having symptoms before you're actually diagnosed with an underactive thyroid. I tend to think of it, it's a bit like running your car with the wrong petrol. You'll carry on going for a while, but then when it stops, you really are in trouble. So there's this great big long series then, and women will come in and they'll tell you, and they'll describe all the symptoms of underactive thyroid, and then they say, but my tests are normal. I sort of say women here. I'm not excluding men from this, but it does seem to be that with our more complex hormonal system, that we're the ones that it tends to manifest in by far the greatest. Okay. When we've been doing tests, we've also been looking at urine tests for iodine insufficiency, and of course these are will only work a certain period of time after you've ingested foods with iodine and that. So they help to indicate, and when you're doing research, it means that you can get your sample group, all your volunteers together, and you can feed them different things and test their urine to see how much they're retaining or how much they have. But again, it's not really a very good long-term test, because of course what you're eating and what you're using up changes all the time. So really the only way of knowing if you've got, just highlighting that, because when we go through test results, it's between over 100 that it's optimal. So the only way that you can really tell if somebody has enough iodine is to look at the iodine that's in the diet. And that's by doing a classic diet diary and recording how much iodine they're actually eating. It's the only way of really telling. And it's quite interesting because to get the RDA in this country is 140 micrograms, which is really, really low. And at Napier's, all the research work we've been doing on is a capsule of half a teaspoon of seaweed a day, which will give you about 350 micrograms. But a heaped teaspoon of seaweed every 3 days, is going to give you enough iodine in your body. If you don't have a heaped teaspoon of seaweed, you've got to either have 1.5 whole mackerel, that's not just the fillets, that's the whole thing, every tail included. 2 large eggs, it's in the eggs because, chickens need it for the mental health of their little chicks as well, and the growth. Fortified foods, lots of nice sugary cereals have it in. Or 3 large glasses of milk. And that's not just milk, that's non-organic milk. All right, what happened was before the Second World War, there was a lot of problems with goiter in this country. It's known as Derbyshire neck. Kids would regularly be told, eat your larva or you'll end up with Derbyshire neck. And so inland populations, if they weren't having seaweed, and everybody knew that people was larva, and they had a great industry going for it in Wales. Charles Dickens, when he used to holiday up here, wrote in his diary that he'd take his penny and he'd go and buy dulse from the fishwives and chew dulse rather than spending it on sweeties because it was such a lovely taste. But there was a problem, and what then happened after the Second World War with improved farming methods was they invented mechanised milking, and of course they started using iodine wash on the cow's udders, so the iodine gets into, and the nation was accidentally fortified with iodine. But as people have switched to organic milk, there's still some in there, but not as much. Or as people are going dairy-free, getting it from milk is becoming a problem, and we're starting to see the nation get that way as well. I'm not here to plug Napier's capsules. You can get iodine from anything, but there's lots and lots of it out there. But we do this one a day, one that we've been doing research with. Iodine and tyrosine. If you actually look at where you get things that have got tyrosine in them, you can see that you're right up there with seaweed as well. So it's been really interesting that seaweed gives us both of those together. Both the iodine and the tyrosine we need. A chart that I haven't put in here because I just came across it recently and haven't totally verified the sources. Being somebody who always likes to go back to the original source and verify, it's quite old. But somebody done some research on B vitamins in seaweeds, and they change throughout the year because for seaweed, springtime is when it's at its best. So I start picking in about February, March, April. I go out there and collect it all and take it home and dry it and turn it into everything else. I cook with it a lot. But by now it's starting to sort of die back a bit, and this hot weather will certainly make it sort of start to die back with the spore and reproduce. And by the heat of the summer in August, it's gone back completely, and it's in the cooler levels, it recovers over the winter. But when you look at the B vitamins in it, and particularly B9, folate, and B12, both of which are absolutely vital to a healthy pregnancy, they all basically start in the spring and go up, and they're really high in the early part of the year, and then they start to taper off and die back by the end of the summer. And I certainly think that, if you go right back to when we were early Homo sapiens, or possibly even Homo habilis, in the northern part of the hemisphere, you see that the spring sunshine entering the pineal gland, and everybody goes into that sort of, reproductive stage. You see it happening with, most animals and birds and things like that. There's no research that goes back that far, but it's an interesting thought to think that, if commonly we'd come out of the winter and start to get pregnant in the early spring as we all sort of woke up from the winter, and we were eating seaweeds, that's when the iodine, the tyrosine, the B9 and the B12, all those really essential things in pregnancy, would have been really high. Because it does seem very strange that nature would have designed us to be so dependent on iodine when it really only comes from the sea. But, sorry, I ramble. Okay, so with fertility, it's all about the hormones with the thyroid. And this is a really nice way of reminding us how it's going back. So the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland, which the thyroid hormone feeds into and controls the speed of, releases all of the other hormones as well. And that just basically sums that up as well. I'm sure you all know this. Okay. So in hypothyroidism, there are problems conceiving, and that's because when you're hypothyroid, you've quite often got lighter and frequent periods. Conversely, when you're hypothyroid, underactive, you can have either lighter and frequent periods, or long, heavy periods as well. But the thyroid, when it starts to malfunction, does start to change periods and frequency of them as well, and also the ovulatory cycle in general. And it's really interesting with a lot of these studies to see how far back we've been aware of this. Back in 1991, they knew that 20% of infertility patients had thyroid problems. And in 1999, another study, 2.3% of infertility patients had elevated TSH, but not necessarily any symptoms. They know that, when they treat people with levothyroxine, they raise the success of people being able to get pregnant again. So this isn't new. And the studies start to get more and more interesting as we get more recent as well. And it varies around the world, obviously, but in some cases as much as 54, as much as half of infertility patients are diagnosed hypothyroid. And if we realise that it's a long way along that journey to hypothyroidism, quite often people are only diagnosed as hypothyroid, in middle age. Young women getting pregnant, quite often hypothyroidism isn't the first thing that you start to think about.
Can I just ask, have you found women are leaving it later to get pregnant these days sometimes? Is that also a pattern normal because as we get older our thyroids become less active? And
I think I certainly feel that it's certainly in the very elderly. It's so common that their thyroids are less active that most doctors don't even bother treating underactive thyroid in the elderly because they're already on so many other drugs as well, and it's sort of expected that they're going to slow down anyway. But I do think it's that the effects of not having it is a sort of malnutrition, basically, as far as I'm concerned. It is a type of malnutrition. And we manage to sort of compensate and manage and keep going. But I think the gradual effect is that it does decline. I'm quite lucky. I'm one of 5 siblings, and we have a tendency to underactive thyroid in our family, so I've got a lot to do it. But I can tell you that nobody in our family ever gets actually diagnosed as having an underactive thyroid until they're over 70 years old. And yet every single one has a completely different metabolic rate and performance when we take seaweed. And we either supplement the seaweed or add it into our diet, And it's really interesting how profound that difference is. Not when you just suddenly take a capsule, but when you run out or you stop doing it for a while, and then you sort of think, oh, I forgot my seaweed, and start taking it again. My brother, who's just turned 50, says that he can actually feel, with him, one of the manifestations, which doesn't affect me, is that his whole digestive tract is slower when he doesn't have enough iodine in seaweed. That's one of the ways it slows down gut function. And that he can actually feel his whole digestion speeding up again when he starts to take his seaweed again. Women in their 30s, you know, they will have had quite a long time of just not quite operating at full power. And yet, I mean, this study's just out that I've only just read a couple of weeks ago. You know, what they were finding was that not just in the mother who's, you know, receiving a donor egg, but the donor's TSH levels themselves. You know, so at that level, it's not just you know, the iodine needed during the pregnancy, but it goes right back to when the egg is actually fertilized. If the thyroid hormone levels are not right at that time, it makes a difference to the whole fertilization. I mean, it's that intrinsic. So, yeah, the evidence is overwhelming. So what to do about it? I mean, I certainly think that everybody getting pregnant should be counselled to make sure that they have enough iodine in their diet. And the simplest thing to do is to use, you know, seaweed in the cooking.
Are you referring to a type of seaweed, like a specific species, or because I know they've got different levels?
So they all have different levels in them. The kelps like this, the kombus, have the highest amount. And things like nori, you know, the nori paper that you get to roll sushi in, you know, each sheet of those only has something like 7 micrograms or something. So it's quite low. But, you know, the body can cope with a huge amount of variance. I'll go on later. I mean, you know, we're told that the safe upper level is about like 1,000. In Japan, it's like 3,000. And you know, our bodies can actually manage, even if we have seaweed only every couple of days. I'll show you that when we look at the Glasgow University research as well. But, you know, powdered seaweed added in, you know, sprinkled onto your food, added into your sauces. You know, I could do a whole presentation on recipes and how to, you know, and cooking with it. But even I, you know, when I'm not, you know, if I don't have it around, if I'm busy, if I'm going to be travelling, you know, I'll take encapsulated seaweed rather than not have it at all. And it has to be from, you know, women from their teens, you know, as soon as they are, you know, the whole hormonal system is starting to kick in, you know, their thyroid needs to be healthy. And, you know, studies that find that, you know, 75-76% of girls at 14 don't have enough iodine in their diet. Well, you know, they're just going to be building on problems the longer they go on without it. And, you know, for a lot of people, you know, at Napier's, when we've had people who have diagnosed underactive thyroid and are on levothyroxine, we've been actually following a lot of cases. We've got a protocol for introducing a measured amount of seaweed, because we know what's in these capsules so well, and reducing the amount of levothyroxine they're on. And in some cases, we've got people coming off it completely. Their thyroids, when they're nourished, you know, return to their normal state. You know, unfortunately, the longer you leave it, the more likely you are to damage your thyroid and not actually be able to return to a normal state. So it's something that people want to think about early on.
Do you mean the longer that you're on levothyroxine, or the longer?
No, the longer that you have a diet with not enough iodine in it. And then the longer you're on levothyroxine. Okay. Yeah, let's not leave the men out. All right. It affects, you know, the thyroid, you know, controls the production and development of healthy sperm. And, you know, and also it has an interaction with leptin. You know, so they found that, you know, in a lot of male infertility, you know, obesity is a problem. You know, well, the thyroid hormones and leptin are both, you know, in the testes, the cells have receptors for both thyroid hormone and leptin. And those are both controlled and linked through the thyroid gland itself as well. So, as we know, because of course, you know, if you don't have enough thyroid and you start to become hypothyroid, you know, one of the first symptoms of it is, you know, challenges basically be able to maintain a healthy body weight. So, I mean, as I said, you know, with men, people tend not to do so many studies because in general, less men tend to have problems. I always joke because there is a certain amount of iodine in beer, but it's actually probably less of the beer and more of the fact that there isn't such a hormonal demand on their thyroid. So assuming that you've gone through the fertility stage and actually got to pregnancy, let's look at some of the ways that the thyroid affects the developing child. Right, okay. 4 times more likely to have a child with autism if there's a weakened thyroid gland. Now, there are lots of other reasons why autism develops as well. But, nevertheless, studies that track it say that, 4 times more likely if the mother's got a weakened thyroid gland. And it can take up to about 9 years old for a child that's been born to a mother that's got hypothyroid diagnosis to actually catch up educationally, even when they're supplemented after birth. The SCAF study, the last one, was actually in New Zealand, where people have a similar sort of dietary profile. Haven't actually managed to find a UK study. But the Hind studies that have been done on women in this country are all about British women, and I think it's 76% of British women are found to not have enough iodine during pregnancy. So we've got, other problems as well. The slightly elevated TSH levels and not enough iodine are also linked to attention deficit disorders and children who can't concentrate and children who are easily distracted. So, how many of these educational problems may actually, be corrected by children, actually being given seaweed in their diet? That'd be interesting to see. And the reason that it can affect children's brains in pregnancy is because at the beginning of the pregnancy, there's this in the first 5 weeks, there's this 50% increase in requirement for the thyroid hormones, and the mother's need for iodine goes up. So the RDA in this country will go up from 140 micrograms to 250 micrograms. And a lot of mothers don't even really know that they're pregnant right away at the beginning. And yet it's those first 5 critical weeks. Somebody may not know for the first 3 weeks, but their body's demanding, double the iodine at that point in time, because that's when, the brain cells are being made and the stem cells. Despite the fact that, British researchers have been talking about this for a long time and saying that it ought to be given huge priority, a lot of people just don't know about it. Our study with the University of Glasgow was published in the British Journal of Nutrition, I think it was last summer or the summer before. And we thought, this is great. We've got some really interesting research here, and we're sure everybody will want to know. If there was a calcium deficiency of this magnitude in the UK, and 76% of teenage girls had calcium deficiency, the newspapers would be full of it. So we contacted all the newspapers, but we were told that unless we had some celebrities who took our capsules, that it wasn't really, so I think it was a small snippet somewhere. People just don't seem to be interested, and it was the government who actually funded. We actually got a government grant to do the work, because the government, someone in the government knows that this is a problem. Okay, we don't have an iodine program in this, an iodine supplementation program in this country. Every now and again people talk about it, like they're talking about the folate one as well. Anyway, one of the things once women have gone through pregnancy as well is that quite often it's just after they've been pregnant that they're diagnosed with an underactive thyroid. And, and a lot of the women that I know who I've talked to about the levothyroxine balance, and I'll say to them, and when were you diagnosed? Well, it was just after I had, just after I wanted children. And it's just such a shame that the doctors don't actually say, and what are you eating? Instead of just, that. When you look at the fatigue and exhaustion and depression, all symptoms of hypothyroidism, is it baby blues or is it thyroid? Okay. So Norway is like us, there's no national supplementation programme. So this, I've just picked out a few studies to look at in a little bit more detail. To see, does it have to be seaweed? So this study in Norway, found that they don't really use a lot of iodine-containing supplements. They've got, low intake of dairy, seafood and eggs. 67% relied on drinking a lot of milk as their main source of iodine. Only a small amount took supplements, only a third. And, 16% had an iodine intake below 100, and 42% below 150. So only 22% of them actually had enough iodine to be pregnant, to actually nourish a developing baby. So that's only 1 in 5 women had enough iodine in their diet to actually sustain a healthy pregnancy. Got another country here. I think we've got Australia. Now, Australia's got a national supplementation program. They put it in their bread. So get lots of people to have bread that's been fortified with potassium iodide. That's the salt. And yet the pregnant women are still iodine insufficient there. And these were the findings.
What is the form of iodine effects?
Yeah. A lot of it will be that, people, just because you put it in the bread, well, not everybody wants to eat bread, particularly when people are on gluten-free diets. And everybody's trying to eat less salt as well, so it doesn't matter if we sneak it into the salt. But it is also the form of iodine as well, which I'll come on to. Okay. Breastfeeding, iodine secreted into the breast milk for the baby. So if you're not getting enough yourself, your baby's not going to be getting it when you're breastfeeding as well. And there we go as well. So Swiss study, mothers of 6 and 12-month-old babies were iodine deficient with a really low 75 micrograms per litre. So, if they're breastfeeding as well, then they're not going to be passing that iodine on for their children's brains to develop, for their bones to develop properly. I talked about the hypothyroid diagnosis. But then that doesn't matter because we can bottle feed them all, can't we? So let's look at bottle feeding. I'll stop that. I've got bottle feeding somewhere. What's this one? Yeah, I think I'm just repeating myself, aren't I? Swiss study. So they've got a salt program in Switzerland, but they found that when they were weaning infants that didn't have iodine supplemented foods, they were as iodine deficient as their mothers were. And I think yes, and here's we're getting to the fortified milk. So the infants that were on the fortified milk, a lot of them seemed to be doing a little bit better than the ones that were being breastfed to iodine deficient mothers. But what they then found was that what is labelled is not actually necessarily in the formula foods as well. So when you look at this last column, you can see that they analysed all these different infant formulas for the amount of iodine that it was supposed to have in it. And some of them had far less, and in some cases, some of them had quite a bit more as well. So that's not reliable either. And, there's a lot of issues now about, soy in baby milk formulas and things too. Okay. One of the things about studies that's really annoying is that when they start to talk about, you know, the median and all the rest of it and how it's not so much of a problem. You know, if you think about, you know, the average, you know, 36% of children having less than they need. You know, what is that statistically in the population? You know, that's, sorry, I'm getting, no, it's not. I think it's just dropped off the bottom of the slide. It was something like 960,000 children in Europe. If you just said, well, you know, let's look at those that aren't in the median. You know, so when statistics are talking about averages and things, you know, they forget that every child actually counts in there. And it's not enough just to say, well, you know, on average, most of them are okay. Well, what about the ones where they're not on average as well? And even when they're quite small, it does seem to affect girls more than boys as well. That was another interesting thing as well, which, you know, means that it's not necessarily just the hormonal development. The hormonal development adds to the burden that it faces with women, but in actual fact, girls seem to be more susceptible to it from a very, very early age. And then, as I said, you know, don't wait, because by 14, 76% of teenagers are iodine insufficient. I mean, one of the things that's worth noting with teenage girls, you know, quite often they've asked to take a seaweed capsule, and, you know, occasionally you might get a fishy burp. They don't really like the idea of taking seaweed. Seaweed's got a bad rap, you know, it's one of those sort of that smelly stuff you get on the beach, you know. But one of the things that you find a lot is that people, you know, who've got acne, you know, teenage acne and, you know, bad skin, taking seaweed regularly actually makes a really big difference to their skin, so they can be easily talked into it. Okay. So we go back to, you know, what do we recommend to people? We recommend that, and here I put seaweed back up at the top. You know, it really is the easiest way of doing it, unless you want to go big on fortified, you know, foods or milk. And obviously fish is great, but very few people are going to have fish every single day, or 2 eggs every day as well.
Excuse me, Monica.
Yeah.
Can you just ask with regard to the eggs? Could it only be eggs that were fed a commercial food that had iodine? If it was hens at home that were just pecking about and getting leftovers and this and that, are they less likely to be iodine depleted?
No, I think eggs, even if with milk, even if you don't have iodine in the wash, there's still some iodine in milk. And it's the same with eggs as well. I mean, if the chickens are given fortified feeds, they'll have higher amounts of iodine, but there will also be iodine because it's necessary for the fetal development of their young as well. You know, and there are other places that you get, you know, small amounts of iodine in, you know, through the diet as well. And it depends according to soil type as well. You know, there's something with, you know, there's high amounts of iodine in non-glaciated soils. And I mean, in the olden days, of course, in the winter, the winter storms would bring all the tangle up onto the beaches, and the farmers would take the carts down, everybody would load it on, and they'd put it on the fields, and it would rot down over the winter. If you go up, I was foraging up at near Port Appin recently, and saw a lot of people's gardens in February sitting under a big blanket of kelp that had been just washed up and brought off the beaches. I use it as a fertiliser in my polytunnels. I'll dig it in over the winter, and you get a much, much bigger yield from the vegetables and plants that you do grow. I think that was you know, remember back in the 70s when Findhorn first started, they were always talking about these sort of, you know, magically huge vegetables. I'm sure they were just using a really good seaweed concentrate. You know, so I'll also rot down seaweed in a big barrel of water and then use that as a liquid fertiliser as well. So, you know, in some places there would have been, you know, in some soils there would be more iodine still in the soil, which will go into the vegetables too. So chickens, you know, would naturally get some, and cows would naturally get some as well.
Can you feed chickens seaweed? Like if you've got manure?
Yeah, I don't keep chickens, I don't know. I know that they'll eat things like chickweed and nettle, and give them nettle to make their shells stronger. People give horses seaweed. You can buy granulated seaweed from any horse supplier.
I give the dog seeds.
You give your dog seaweed? So we're so kind to our animals, just not our children. The other thing is that, this is a really interesting point here. And cows and chickens don't normally go around, brushing their teeth and gargling with fluoride and iodine and things as well. I've got a picture somewhere of the periodic table just to remind you. Just recapping on how much iodine in pregnancy. I've made a mistake there. The minimum UK RDA is not 150 anymore. It's now only 140. I think that's really I think 140 is really scraping the bottom of the barrel. I cannot function on 140. My intake has to be about 700 micrograms. Otherwise, I'm, just a balloon. It makes a big difference. So anyway. Yes, it definitely needs to increase in pregnancy too. Yeah, and here's the periodic table, of course. So the elements at the top can displace the ones lower down. So if you're only getting very small amounts of iodine in your diet, because you're only getting it from special K, it could quite easily be knocked out by the other things. And you look at, where do you get bromide, the one above it? Bromide is a bleach. So flour is bleached with bromide, and rice is bleached with bromide. And then chlorine, of course, chlorine's in water. Bromides, I think some form of bromide is also quite often used in spas. Is there not some water treatment program for certain spas and swimming pools where they use bromide to bleach instead of chlorine? I can't remember. And then, of course, fluoride as well, which is in so many, in some cases, in the water as well. So if you've only got very small amounts of iodine coming in, you might just be knocking it straight out as well. Oh yeah, and this is the other thing, seaweed's scary, iodine's scary. We might all sort of, go out for a Japanese meal and come back with an overactive thyroid. So the British 140 got it right there, and pregnancy 250, and the Japanese, bless them, they eat between 1,000 and 3,000 micrograms of iodine a day. In their seaweed. In some cases it goes up to, 27,000 micrograms suddenly. It's just as well the body can regulate itself pretty easily. So in Japan, in the Ministry of Health, they've analysed the diets. And what happens in Japan is that, apart from people who live right on the coast and who've got a particular sort of fetish for having kombu, this one, on a daily basis, which occasionally will disrupt things. And then when you look at Japan, there are occasional studies where they said, and there's this population that got goiter, and this shows that seaweed's really dangerous. But they're very small studies compared to the enormous amount of studies there are that show that they actually do it quite balanced. And what they tend to do is that they eat different seaweeds in different amounts at different times. And, as far as I'm concerned with the diet, a lot of it's all about variety. If you're going to do something, in excess, don't do it too often or too many times. If you think, because I teach a lot of foraging, so follow the seasons very closely, and a lot of people think that, seasonality is about whether or not they're flying the asparagus in from Peru, or the strawberries in from Spain, but it's not just that, it's also about entire food groups. And, if you were, in August, and you came across a huge bush full of blackcurrants or something like that, you'd have scoffed a lot. You wouldn't have gone like, I only had like 3 portions a day. You'd have scoffed a lot, for days on end. Your body can cope with that excess because you're not then going to get much sugar till, where do you get your sugar at this time of year from the wild? Yeah. It's not there. So it's the same with a lot of the foods, with a lot of the things where there's toxicity or poison issues. Wood sorrel. Google will tell you not to eat too much of wood sorrel. This tiny, tiny little plant you can put in your salad. because it's got incredibly high levels of oxalic acid, which is like rhubarb leaves, you can have oxalic acid poisoning. I actually worked out you'd need to eat 4 kilos a day for about 10 days to get oxalic acid poisoning. And we would never do that, So it's the same thing as well. If you're going to overeat on anything, and seaweed comes in that category just as much, just don't do it for very long. So, sort of wandering around, going back to Japan, what they actually did was that they analysed in the population, how much seaweed do people actually eat? So they followed their diet, and they have a bit of kombu soup and some dashi on one day, and then they're having some, sushi with the nori, which is very low in iodine. And then they worked out that on average, most people in Japan eating a traditional diet, on average, will have about 3,000 micrograms, and that's what they're consuming. That's what they all seem healthy as. So that's what their safe limit is there. So let's look how the Japanese compared with the Americans or us, even with infant deaths, less. All of these, obviously, there are other factors as well. It's not just the seaweed and the iodine, it's the way that they, they ferment things, it's their approach to carbs and sugar and junk food and McDonald's and everything else. But, they do consume a lot of seaweed as well, and it's got to have an impact. So this was the research that we did with the University of Glasgow Medical School, because we wanted to see, exactly what is happening with the iodine from seaweed inside the body. And so we had 50 healthy volunteers. They were all screened to be healthy, so they weren't taking any vitamins or supplements. None of them were diagnosed with anything. And then we started to actually, measure. Well, 52% of them were found to be iodine insufficient by analysing their diets. They all had to keep diet diaries. So looking at what they said they ate in their diet diaries, 52% were iodine insufficient. And those 52% did have, higher levels than the others of thyroid-stimulating hormone. So in the upper 25%, which goes back to those children who, develop ADHD, attention deficit disorder. Their TSH isn't so high that they're diagnosed as being hyperthyroid, but it's in that upper quartile where the levels are higher than they should, than everybody else. But they were perfectly happy, functioning Glaswegian students. Okay. So one of the things that we wanted to look at was different types of iodine, because in populations where they're putting potassium iodide in salt, you're also in some of those populations then getting a higher incidence of overactive thyroid. So there are studies which will show you that where people are being given iodine, mainly in national salt programs, that they are getting hyperthyroid. Hence, iodine ought to be scary. But what they're using is potassium iodide. So we actually put in exactly the same amount of potassium iodide into their bodies on one day. And on different days, we then put it in the 350 micrograms, but in the form of seaweed, taking this capsule of seaweed which was measured. Okay. And what did we find? Hang on, sorry, I'm missing a bit at the bottom there. What we actually found was that the potassium iodide goes into the body all the way, and the seaweed iodine only goes in 37%. Okay, so out of the iodine that you're taking from seaweed, your body only uses 37%. All right, the potassium iodide then went, what your body didn't use, out of that 100% went in, then went out within a couple of hours, was sort of excreted in your urine within a couple of hours. With the seaweed, it took 3 days to leave the body. Okay, so instead of having, a little spike every time you intake some iodine from the salt, if you're doing it with seaweed, what you've got is a gentle sort of 3-day cycle where you've got this much more gentle flow of iodine to the thyroid. they then took them for 2 weeks, these capsules for 2 weeks, just one capsule for 2 weeks. And at the end of it, what we found was that all of the students that had the higher TSH levels and the iodine insufficiency had gone back into the normal range. Now, you'd have thought, okay, well, if you look at that study, then the ones who had perfectly normal TSH levels and normal amounts of iodine, if the others were all coming up back to normal, then they should have sort of increased a bit as well. But what was interesting was that everything normalised. Everything actually normalised. So, instead of one here and one here, then both going up like that, everything sort of normalised into this normal range. So nobody actually went outside the safe range.
What's controlling the normal range then? I mean, we talk about
So this is
what the British call the normal range of TSS, or what the Germans call it?
This is the British range of TSH,
which is huge, isn't it?
and iodine, urinary iodine between 100 and 150 micrograms. Okay, I can. If anybody wants a copy of this study, which has also got diagrams in it, I can more than happy to email it to you, so you can have a look. Okay, so what we think is that it's not just important to have iodine, but it's important to take the right sort of iodine. And I get quite worried when I've seen a few people who self-diagnosed with an underactive thyroid, and the doctors, reach sort of nowhere with the doctor, and they start to take things like iodine, all these drops, which have got potassium iodide in. And a lot of them do go on to have some really, severe problems, particularly if they're taking very large doses of them. We've had, in the last 3 years that I've been working on this, we've had one case that, one reported back case, and I do encourage anybody to report back. Anybody I'm working with or through the clinic, encourage them to report back if they think the side effects are over. And we've had one person who had Hashimoto's thyroiditis, an autoimmune disease of the thyroid. And she was very sensitive to iodine and found that taking encapsulated seaweed every day did take her into this slightly overactive category. But on stopping taking it, she immediately, normalised again. So, but that's one person. But with potassium iodide, creating these spikes, I'm a lot more suspicious of that, and suspicious of studies where they say that iodine does push you over. They don't always tell you how they delivered that iodine as well. And the other thing is that with the potassium iodide going out of your body so quickly, you've then got sort of whole gaps without it as well. It's these spikes. Whereas with the seaweed matrix delivering it, and this is to do with the way that the other things that seaweed's got in it as well, it's that complex, that quite complex structure, and they extract a lot of it to thicken toothpaste, and quite often they'll put the alginates into diet pills, which will swell in your stomach. That's how a lot of them work. You swell up so you don't feel so full because you're full of sort of swollen alginate from seaweed. But it does seem to be that when you've got this whole food with the alginate and everything as all part of it together, that the seaweed then releases it quite slowly in the gut, and it behaves sort of quite differently as well. So if I could do a movement, it would be that if you're supplementing with iodine, you're going like that, and if you're eating seaweed every couple of days, you're just there's lovely rolling supply. So I think you've all got my message now. We just need to see it. Okay.
If you're using hydrogen seaweed and aiming for the 1 teaspoon a day, what are the losses from cooking?
It does affect it. And the vitamins in it as well. When we tested this seaweed some years ago, we also tested it against some of the commercially got seaweeds. So this seaweed is the sea greens that comes from the Outer Hebrides here. So it's organically certified, it's coming from conservation waters, but critically it's dried at low temperatures. And when that's compared against commercially gathered seaweed, where trawler ships have kind of hoovered it up from the bottom of the ocean along with everything else, what you'll find is that that the sea green seaweed is 70% on average higher in the iodine, the B vitamins, and everything except sand, silica. You know, silica is the only thing that it's lower in when you compare it to commercially dried ones. When they bring them onto those big trawler ships, you know, they've got a lot of this thick, you know, big wet seaweed which takes up a lot of space, and it, you know, and they put it into very, very high temperature kilns. So we know from that you know, that when it's dried at high temperature, you know, you will lose iodine and vitamins. You know, you'll degrade it to a certain point. But I tend to, with the kombus, these big thick ones, I'll quite often put those in at the beginning. I tend to use, a section like that in the same way that other people use Baileys. I put it into the soups and stews. And I don't break it up, you know, I take it out at the end and hide it so nobody in the house knows they've got seaweed in their meal yet again. Because I do have some rebels, you know, and the children never like to know that there's seaweed in their food. And because that's very high, and because this species is very... Sorry,
I think we have to vacate the premises by 5.
Oh, sorry.
I'd like to thank you for your absolutely super presentation, very informative, and just the kind of thing that we all need to know about, and the detail, and the seaweed, obviously we can get it in Edinburgh.
Well, or you can go down to the seaside. Mara seaweed to do seaweed, Atlantic seaweed. I've just got a little booklet about that sort of summarises the seaweed thing as well, if people would like that too.
Are we allowed to take one?
Yeah, definitely.
Thank you very much.
All right.